everyone, and welcome to Module 2 of Chapter 8. So in this module, we are going to talk about problem solving, judgment, and decision making. And as I mentioned in the last video, I'm going to try to make this relatively quick. If I can squeeze them both into one class, or at least most of both of them into one class, that means that we'll be able to end a little early and have our last class on Monday as opposed to Wednesday. So I'm going to try, we'll see what happens with this one, but hopefully we'll be able to make it work and fit basically modules 1, 2, and 3 in either tomorrow, Wednesday's class, or Friday's class. So problem solving is accomplishing a goal when the solution or the path to the solution is not clear. So there are two basic strategies that we can use. We can either use an algorithm, which is basically kind of based on a set of rules, or we can use a heuristic, which is kind of like our best guess, or kind of going with our intuition. And so algorithms are basically defined as problem-solving strategies that are based on a series of rules. They're a set of procedures that guarantee the correct answer, so they will find the correct answer. They're very kind of methodical. They're very useful when you have a well-defined problem with a clear nature and one kind of clear solution. Heuristics, on the other hand, are problem-solving strategies that stem from prior experience. They provide an educated guess as to what the most likely solution is. So they basically suggest what might be a good option, but they don't guarantee that it is the optimal solution. So they can be helpful when a problem has no specific goal and no clearly correct solution, so you can't really use an algorithm to kind of methodically find the answer. And so they're often used to kind of help you limit your options. So basically kind of the main difference between them would be an algorithm being kind of objective, logical, and slow. So for example, kind of you following a recipe, if you're making a dish or, baking a cake, following the recipe would be using kind of an algorithm because you're basically kind of going about it step by step in a methodical pattern. Whereas heuristics are more subjective, intuitive, and quick. So for example, if you're deciding what to eat for supper, there is no right solution. You can kind of consider your options. Maybe you go based on prior experience, things that you've enjoyed in the past. So you're more likely to use a method like a heuristic, which is subjective, intuitive, and quick. So in a game like Hangman, your job is basically, as you know, to guess the letters in a word. And so if you were going to use an algorithm to go about this task, then basically what you could do is start with A and then guess B and then guess C. That would be kind of very methodical and rule-based. Another type of algorithm you could use is to basically consider which letters are most common in the English language. So maybe it's like an E and then a T or something like that. I'm not sure exactly which ones are, but basically you could kind of go in that order and kind of guess the most common, and the second most common, and the third most common letter. So those would be examples of using algorithms. Unfortunately, continuing to use an algorithm in a game like Hangman is probably not going to allow you to win the game. Because although they are very methodical and eventually would guarantee you the right answer, when you only have so many options, so many tries, like in a game of Hangman, you wouldn't really probably get the word before it's too late. So the better option in a game like this would be maybe to use an algorithm at first, so you could, guess one of the most popular letters that you know, but then as you start to see patterns emerge, you can kind of switch to using a heuristic. So for example, if you notice that the last letter is a G, then it's very likely the letter before it is an N, because a lot of words end in ing. So using kind of examples from your previous experience and things that you kind of, your prior knowledge, can be very helpful in determining the correct answer. So now we're going to talk a bit about some cognitive obstacles. So there are times when you're trying to problem solve and the rules and strategies that we just discussed might actually get in the way of your problem solving. So sometimes we have trouble doing what we term thinking outside of the box. So for example, if you look at the 5-daughter problem here, Maria's father has 5 daughters, Lala, Leela, Lila, and Lola. What is the 5th daughter's name? So you can think about that for a second. A lot of people would kind of intuitively say Lula, just because you've got La, Li, Li, Lo. But of course, if you consider it logically, you'll notice that the answer is Maria, because it was Maria's father who has these 4 daughters. So Maria would be the fifth daughter. So sometimes using those kind of algorithms and specific ways of problem solving and even heuristics can kind of actually get in the way of our ability to solve a problem. Another common example, and this employs something that we call a mental set, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the 9-dot problem. So I'm going to give you a minute now to write the 9 dots on your paper. Try to use only 4 straight lines, and without lifting your pen or pencil, connect all of the dots. And I won't really pause so much here, but if you want to pause the video right now, you can try that out. And so now I'm going to show you how, or at least, well, not how to solve, but at least one way of solving that problem. There are multiple ways. A lot of people get stuck because they assume that you have to stay within the dots. They assume that you can't really kind of extend your lines past the box made of dots. But if you look at the answer here, you can see that one solution is basically to kind of go outside of the boundary, because we tend to see those outer edges of the dots as kind of a boundary, and actually kind of make your pattern in that way. So a lot of people would assume that because you have kind of the boundary caused by the outer edges of dots that you're not able to go outside of it, but that wasn't actually specified in the problem. So this is an example of a mental set. So a cognitive obstacle that occurs when an individual attempts to apply a routine solution to what is actually a new type of problem. So just because in the past, a lot of the time if you saw stuff like this, it would probably say something along the lines of not going outside the box, quite literally. We really need to kind of think outside of the box in this case. So a mental set can also occur when an individual applies a routine solution when a much easier solution is possible. So sometimes they might, for example, if you're given a math problem, a lot of the times it's actually possible to kind of guess the solution based on some cues in the problem, especially if it's a multiple choice type question. But a lot of people will kind of go further and do all the work just because they assume they kind of have to get the solution when in reality the solution was quite obvious and they probably could have picked it out without actually performing the functions. So here's another example of a problem in which you might have a cognitive obstacle. So imagine you are standing between 2 strings and you need to tie them together. The only problem is you cannot reach both strings at the same time. In the room with you is a table, a piece of paper, a pair of pliers, and a ball of cotton. What do you do? So again, a lot of people look at this, and you can pause now if you want to kind of think about it and try to figure it out on your own. But a lot of people look at this and they basically get caught up in seeing the objects as only being useful for their kind of most typical purpose. So for example, people think, okay, pliers, I'm going to use pliers to grasp something. They think cotton ball, I don't know what you use a cotton ball for, maybe cleaning ears or something. Piece of paper, we use it to write, you can make a paper airplane, but none of those functions of those objects would really help you solve the task. However, if we look at the solution, which is on the next slide here, you can see that one way to solve this problem would be to use the pliers as kind of a pendulum. So attach them to one of the strings, swing them back and forth, and then while grasping the other string, you kind of wait basically for the makeshift pendulum that you've made out of those pliers to swing back towards you. And so this is a really interesting solution because a lot of people look at a pair of pliers and they assume, okay, it has that one function for grasping, for pinching, but they fail to see that there are other functions outside of the intended purpose. So that's what we call functional fictionness. So when we can only think of one function for an operator, we identify, a potential thing that might help us, but can only think of its most obvious function, then that can stop us from, again, kind of thinking outside the box and coming up with kind of more creative ways to use those things. So now I want to talk briefly about reasoning. So reasoning is any kind of purposeful mental activity that involves operating on information to reach a conclusion, and it requires us to draw specific inferences. So you'll notice that these terms don't actually come from this textbook. They don't really cover them, but I wanted to bring them up because I think they're important to kind of keep in mind going forward for the rest of this module. So there's 2 different types of reasoning problems. We can have a formal reasoning problem, which specifies clearly what information you need to draw the conclusion, and they have a single right or best answer. So those would be the types of problems that you'd be more likely to use an algorithm for. So things like an IQ test or an entrance exam question. On the other hand, we have what are known as informal reasoning problems, which often do not have one clearly correct solution, and we must decide from competing approaches or solutions as to which is the most reasonable solution. So again, just like we see that the formal reasoning problems are kind of probably better suited to an algorithmic approach, we can see that the informal reasoning problems may be more suited to a heuristic approach, because there isn't really one correct answer to come to. So in order to solve this type of problem, kind of an informal reasoning type problem, a person must use what's known as dialectical reasoning, which is a process that involves comparing and evaluating opposing viewpoints to resolve differences. So essentially it's what juries are supposed to do when they're trying to reach a verdict. So if they're sitting and debating and looking at kind of evidence to support both sides, whether, say the individual is guilty or not guilty, they would be engaging in what we call dialectical reasoning. So basically comparing those two viewpoints and trying to find which one is the best fit. Unfortunately, there are many barriers that can prevent us from reasoning rationally. So that's kind of why I wanted to define what reasoning is. So we're going to go through a bunch of different barriers. I believe the last one, hindsight bias, isn't actually covered in this textbook, but I think it's a really important one, so I wanted to kind of keep it in here. But the rest of them, if you want kind of more examples and a better description, they are described kind of in a bit more detail within your textbook. So here are some biases and heuristics that can kind of get in the way when we're trying to reason rationally and can prevent us from doing so. So first we're going to talk about conjunction fallacies and representativeness. So I'm going to define those in a minute for you. But first I want you to read this example and consider the following question. So Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more likely? A, that she is a bank teller, or B, that she is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? So I'll give you a second to consider that question. At this point, you've probably kind of assumed, because I'm giving you a second to consider it, and the answer is seemingly obvious, that there must be some kind of catch to this question. So a lot of people will end up saying that it's more likely that she's a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. And that's because, based on the information we're provided, Linda does seem to be somebody who would possibly be active in the feminist movement. However, we're making a fatal error in our reasoning here, and I'll tell you why. So we're falling prey to something that's known as the conjunction fallacy. So that's the mistaken belief that finding a specific member in two overlapping categories is more likely than finding any member of one of the larger general categories. So we asked, which is more likely? Is it more likely that she is a bank teller, or more likely that she is a bank teller and involved in the feminist movement? And even though there's a lot of information that would seem to indicate that she'd be involved in the feminist movement, it is never going to be more likely, statistically, that somebody falls into two different categories than they just fall into one or the other. So for example, if I took a sample of, I don't know, let's say 100 people, and within that sample, 10 of them are bank tellers. I know that's a pretty high proportion, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, I have 100 people, 10 of them are bank tellers, and within 100 people, 7 of them are within the feminist movement. Or maybe even 20 of them are representative of the involved in the feminist movement. It is never going to be more likely that a member will be part of both of those categories than will be part of just one of them. So if they have a, say, 10% chance of being a bank teller, and maybe it's 7 out of 100, so 7% chance of being part of the feminist movement, the chance that they are a bank teller and part of the feminist movement would be definitely less than 10 or 7%, because they would have to kind of be a member of both of the categories overlapping. So only so many of the people who are bank tellers are also probably going to be a member of the feminist movement, maybe 1 in the 100. So this fallacy demonstrates the use of the representativeness heuristic, because we're making our judgment of likelihood based on how well an example represents a specific category. So in this case, we read about Linda and we thought, hey, she's been involved in all of these kind of different movements and things like that. So it's pretty likely that she would be someone who'd be involved in the feminist movement. So we're saying she seems to represent our idea of someone who would be involved in that type of movement fairly well. And in that respect, it's causing an error in our judgment because it's causing us to actually overestimate the probability that she would be both a bank teller and active in that movement. However, the representativeness heuristic is not always wrong. It can actually be very helpful at times. So, for example, if you were walking in a department store, and this example is from the textbook and it kind of relates to Target. So we don't really have Targets here in Canada anymore, so hopefully the example kind of makes sense to you. But basically, if you spot someone who is wearing a red shirt and tan pants, which is the uniform of this particular department store, and it's kind of a young man in his 20s. And so if you think of it logically, if you say, is it more likely that a young man would be wearing a red shirt and tan pants in this store, or that a young man would be wearing a red shirt and tan pants in the store and be an employee of the store, then technically, logically, it's more likely that he is just wearing red pants and a shirt and not also an employee of the store. However, in that case, you're probably pretty likely to be right, that he would be an employee of the store as well. So in that case, even though technically it's less likely that he's an employee of the store than he just wears that clothing on a regular basis, we should still maybe kind of take that chance in that case and kind of ask him for help. So next we're going to talk about the availability heuristic. So another heuristic we use to make our judgments is the availability heuristic. So estimating the frequency of an event based on how easy examples of it come to mind. So at times this can lead us to errors. For example, if we are asked to think of all the English words you know that start with the letter K versus words that have K as the third letter, you'd probably be likely, based on the fact that you're probably more likely to be able to easily come up with words that start with K, to say that there are more that start with K than that have K as a third letter. And in that instance, you would actually be wrong, because there are more letters in the English language that have K as a third letter. But because they're a little harder for us to think of or come up with examples of, we tend to estimate them as less frequent. The same thing can also occur sometimes with thinking about natural disasters or traumatic events. So a lot of the time people overestimate the chance that they would be involved in, say, a plane crash, or kind of be in a place that has a severe earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane or something like that. And typically the reason they're overestimating these probabilities is because it's really easy to think of examples of those things. Another example is shark attacks. I love to give this example because a lot of people would say, if I asked you, are you more likely to be killed by a cow or a shark? The majority of people will say shark, obviously, because they think of sharks as dangerous. You can think of times in movies and in the media that you've heard of shark attacks, but actually you're far more likely to be killed by a cow. The proportion of people who are actually killed by shark attacks is very, very low. However, because the image of somebody being killed by a shark is so kind of available in your mind, it's something that easily comes to mind based on your exposure, you are more likely to overestimate its probability and underestimate the probability of being killed by animals that are typically kind of considered to be more gentle. However, at times the availability heuristic can help us make quick and correct judgments. So for example, if I asked you which are more frequent, words that begin with K versus words that begin with T, in that case you would probably say T, because you can probably come up with more examples of words that begin with T, and in that case you would be right. So the availability heuristic, and most of these biases, honestly, they're not always wrong. It just kind of shows us some ways in which our reasoning can be affected. Next, we're going to talk briefly about anchoring and framing effects. So there are some heuristics that are based on how the problems are presented. So for example, the wording we use, the variety of options that are given, and the frames of reference that are kind of provided within the question. So the anchoring effect occurs when an individual attempts to solve a problem involving numbers and uses previous knowledge in order to keep or kind of anchor the response within a limited range. So for example, researchers have asked the same question to different groups, And based on the number that's provided within the question, they've gotten very different responses. So if you're asked to estimate the proportion of something and you have no idea what the proportion is, and the person gives you, do you think it's more or less than 5%? Well, if you have no idea, you're likely to take that 5% in the question and kind of use it as an anchor to keep your answer fairly close to that value. Whereas if they asked you, what proportion do you think this is? Do you think it's more or less than 70%? Well, then you're more likely to have a much higher estimate because, again, you're using that number that they gave you as part of the question to kind of anchor your response to be kind of within that range of values. So an example from research is people were asked either the first question, what percentage of African nations belong to the United Nations? Is it greater than or less than 10%? And what do you think the exact percentage is? And another group was asked, what percentage of African nations belong in the UN? Is it greater than or less than 65%? And what do you think the exact percentage is? And it was shown that the average estimate for percentage for the first question was about 25. So it was relatively close to that 10% value. However, when you were asked to estimate the percentage and you were asked, is it greater than or less than 65%, the people in that group had an average guess of about 45%. So you can see that the number increased to kind of be more in line with that value given in the question. So again, those values that are provided in the question kind of anchor your response to be fairly near a certain kind of value. And next we'll talk about framing effects. So the tendency for choices to differ depending on how the choice is framed, so kind of how it's worded. So if it's framed in terms of losing something, people tend to be more cautious because nobody likes to lose things. Versus if this very same choice is framed in terms of what you could win or what you could gain, people tend to take a little bit more of a risk. So for example, if I said, buy this lotto ticket, you have a 1% chance of winning a bunch of money. Then you'd probably say, okay, you know what, I'll try it out. 1%, like it's a lot of money, like that seems like a decent odd. But if I framed it to you in terms of buy this ticket, you have a 99% chance of losing or not making any money, then you're less likely to want to buy it then because I framed it in terms of kind of the negative outcome instead. And so this effect is really well kind of characterized by a very classic example. Which would you prefer? If I told you I had a program, like say a vaccine or a treatment, that will definitely save 200 of 600 people, or one that has a 1/3 probability of saving them all, but a 2/3 probability of not saving any people. So in this case, if I frame the choice to you in that way, that you can definitely save 200 people, or you have a chance of saving them all, but another chance of saving none, a lot of people tend to pick the first choice because it's framed in terms of how many people you could save. It's telling you could definitely save 200 people. But what people fail to realize about that is if you're definitely saving 200 of the 600, that means you're actually definitely also killing 400 of the 600. But people don't think of that because it's framed in terms of who you can save. However, if we frame it kind of in the opposite way, which one would you prefer? One in which 400 of 600 people definitely die, or one that has a 1/3 probability of no one dying and 2/3 of them all dying, then a lot of people are more likely to pick kind of the more risky options. They'll pick the second option. Or sorry, I shouldn't say more risky, I guess, but they're more likely to pick the second option because the first one is framed in terms of what you would definitely lose. So even though it's technically the exact same odds, people tend to pick the first choice in that first scenario, whereas they tend to pick the second choice in the second scenario. So here's kind of a visual example of what was going on there. So you can see in problem 1, vaccine A has a 100% probability that 1/3 are saved. And vaccine B has a 1/3 probability they're all saved, but a 2/3 probability that none are saved. Well, most people will pick A because they think, hey, well, at least I'm definitely saving however many people. Whereas if you frame it in terms of 100% probability that 2/3 will die versus 1/3 probability that no one dies and 2/3 that they all die, a lot of people will then choose to go with the second option because they don't want to be responsible for people definitely dying. even though if you look at it logically, the options are exactly the same. So obviously, if you are definitely saving 200 of the 600, you are definitely allowing 400 of the 600 to die. But again, people don't tend to see it like that. Based on how it's framed, based on how it's worded, people tend to make different choices. So that is an example of the framing effect. So now I'd like to talk briefly about belief perseverance and confirmation bias. So belief perseverance occurs when an individual believes he or she has the solution to the problem or the correct answer for a question, even in the face of evidence against it. So a lot of the time, if people have a certain opinion or a certain belief, and you try to present them with evidence that disconfirms this belief, they don't really want to accept that evidence, which makes sense because nobody really wants to be told that they're wrong. But this can be very dangerous because it can get in the way of critical thinking, and definitely in terms of the scientific process, it's something that can be very damaging because obviously one of the main principles of being a good scientist, as we talked about way back in chapter 2, is willingness to kind of accept change and be open to alternative possibilities. So an example of belief perseverance can be really well illustrated when talking about people's belief in a particular political party. So for example, if you have two different political parties, let's for the sake of argument just say liberal and conservative, and you have members of both parties and they observe video of a young person who is stealing, say, campaign signs off of the lawns of people supporting one politician or the other. And then you ask those people, do you consider this a harmless prank or do you consider it stealing? People are more likely to say that they consider it stealing and consider it a crime if the signs being stolen are of the party that they support. So for example, if a conservative person watches a video of a young person stealing a conservative sign, or a sign for a conservative constituent off of someone's lawn, they're more likely to judge that as stealing. Whereas if they watch somebody who steals a liberal sign off somebody's lawn, they're more likely to consider that a harmless prank. And the way that works is that they assume that the person who's stealing kind of the liberal sign, if they're conservative, is probably conservative like them, and therefore they're less likely to kind of judge them for it. They want to believe that, people who support their party wouldn't be kind of bad people, so they'd be more likely to judge it as a prank. Whereas when they observe the individual stealing a sign from their own political party, they assume that that person is against that party, and therefore they're more likely to harshly judge them and kind of consider that to be kind of a crime rather than just a prank. So you can see how kind of depending on what belief they have, they don't really want to be confronted with any evidence that would make people who share their belief look like bad people, because they in turn would then feel like, well, maybe they're a bad person too. Very related to belief perseverance is the confirmation bias, which occurs when an individual searches for or only pays attention to evidence that confirms a previously held belief, instead of evidence that might disconfirm it. So they're very, very similar. Belief perseverance is basically saying that they have a very strong belief, and even if you present them with information that would tentatively disconfirm it, they basically refuse to accept that information. Whereas a confirmation bias is more of the act of kind of only seeking out information that supports your belief. So both very similar and related to each other. And this bias is, unfortunately, as I mentioned, the reason that the scientific method can be so difficult, because scientific methods force us to examine evidence and consider evidence that would disconfirm our belief. So unfortunately, if people are very high in things like belief perseverance and confirmation bias, they're much less likely to be open to kind of scientific change and kind of engaging in the scientific process. Finally, we have the hindsight bias, and this one is pretty straightforward. So it occurs when people learn the outcome of an event or an answer to a question and become sure that they knew it all along. So for example, if you watched kind of a sports event with your favorite sports teams and your team won, you might say afterwards, oh, I knew they were going to win. Even if halfway through the game you were kind of biting your nails because it was super close and you weren't really certain if they were going to win at all. So people tend to overestimate the likelihood that they could have predicted the result beforehand, after the fact. And so the hindsight bias can be adaptive when trying to make sense of the past. So obviously we don't want to dwell on our mistakes. So being able to kind of move on from mistakes we might have made and kind of think of it as, oh, well, I probably could have got that anyway, or would have known that anyway. That can be adaptive at times, but it can also make us less willing to find out what we need to know in order to make accurate future predictions. So consider the case of a doctor who was trying to treat a patient and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with them for a very long time. And then finally they were able to confirm the diagnosis, and then they think, oh, you know what, I knew that all along. Even if, they had made a mistake and gone through several diagnoses before that. And so in that case, that doctor is likely then to, next time they see a patient, kind of again assume that they have the appropriate knowledge instead of learning from the mistake that they made. So it is adaptive in terms of allowing us to let go of the mistakes we've made in the past, but it can also be dangerous when we fail to learn from the mistakes we made because we are so confident that we would have known it all along and that we'd know better next time. And finally, I want to talk briefly about maximizing and satisficing. So maximizing and satisficing are basically two different ways of consuming things. So there are two types of consumers. A satisficer is someone who seeks to make the decisions that are good enough. So say if you were going to go shopping for a new computer and you look around maybe one or two stores, you find one that does what you want and you say, okay, good enough, I'm going to take it, and you go home. On the other hand, a maximizer is somebody who attempts to evaluate every option for every choice until they find the one that is the perfect fit for them. And an example of this would be, you're shopping for a computer, so you have to go to 5 different stores, you check out a bunch of websites, you compare all the specs, you compare all the prices, and you try your best to kind of exhaust all options to ensure that you're getting the best deal and you're getting kind of what you would consider your money's worth. So in that respect, many people would believe that the maximizer might be the most satisfied shopper. Surely, they spent all this time shopping and they made sure that they compared all the specs, and you would think that they tend to be more satisfied in general with the results of their purchasing, but it's often not the case. So one example given is that a lot of the time people who are maximizers, they tend to end up with jobs that have higher salaries because they kind of refuse to settle for anything less than exactly what they're looking for, but they tend to be less happy about their jobs in general. So one reason that this might occur, and that, satisficers in general might be kind of more happier with their decisions than a maximizer would be, is due to something called the paradox of choice. So it's been shown that more choices can actually lead to less satisfaction overall. So if there are more choices, someone who's a maximizer has to put far more effort in because they have to kind of compare more options and weigh the pros and cons and do the research. So because they put more effort in to making the decision, they then expect the results to be a lot better. They expect it to be kind of the best it can be. If you spent, 10 hours researching before buying that computer, well, you better hope that it's the best computer you've ever seen in your life. Whereas if somebody only spent 30 minutes, they picked out something and they went home with it, even if it's not, amazing, they're probably still going to be okay with it because they didn't really invest so much effort into the process of picking it up. So unfortunately, a lot of the time we see that paradox of choice. So having more choices actually leads to less satisfaction overall, especially for a maximizer. A lot of the studies that have been done on these type of topics are correlational in nature, so we can't really be kind of 100% sure of the results, but it is kind of a really interesting phenomenon. And I'll show you one more example on the last slide here. So this is a table from another study in which people were offered either a choice of 6 chocolates or a choice of 30 chocolates, but they could only choose one. So in the first option, of course, you could have 1 out of 6, so you have basically like a 1 in 6 chance of picking any individual chocolate, whereas in the second scenario, you could have any of the 30 chocolates, so you can pick 1 in 30. And so the thing is, a maximizer, because it takes them so much longer to invest the effort in kind of deciding between the different alternatives, they tend to be more satisfied with their choice and rate the chocolate as better if they have less choices to make. So choosing between 6 versus choosing between 30. So you can see here the maximizers rated their satisfaction as higher, so 5.64, when there were only 6 alternatives compared to when there were 30 alternatives. So they rated their satisfaction as 4.73 in that case. Whereas the satisficers, because they don't invest as much time in their decision, they were just kind of pleased to have more choices. So in their mind, they were more satisfied when they had a choice out of 30 than when they had a choice out of 6. So you can see the differences here. So the maximizers were less satisfied by a difference of 0.91 when they had more alternatives, whereas the satisficers were more satisfied by a difference of 0.46 when they had more choices to choose from. And that is the end of Module 2. So altogether, these first 2 modules only take up about 55 minutes. So hopefully you're able to get through the majority of them for tomorrow's class, Wednesday, the 2nd of December. And then what I'm going to do is I will post the 3rd module before Friday's class, so by Thursday night at the latest. And then hopefully we'll be able to finish up the end of Module 2 if you haven't finished it, and then the rest of Module 3, because it should be a short one, for Friday's class, December the 4th. And then if we can manage to get that done, then we can have a in-person, or well, at least through Zoom, a live review class on Monday, December 7th. So thank you for watching, and I will talk to you in the last and final video of the semester.